So hello everyone. Another outtake. Hello everyone. My name is Grace Bello. I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and my graduate degree is in historical archaeology. So that means I study archaeology, I dig things out of the ground, but I mostly focus on things in the quote-unquote historic period. So that means after Europeans got to the New World here in the Northeast specifically. My master's thesis focused on developing a method for dating and identifying historic window glass. And I know that kind of sounds a little bit boring, but it's really interesting to me. And on that topic, I'm going to apologize now for the statistics in this presentation. I'll try and keep them short, but the math is really, really important. So I won't make it super, super technical.
Yeah, that's okay. It's okay. I'll do it for you.
Oh, wait. Is it just that? I think I was pressing the wrong button. It's great being young and knowing technology. So, anyway, for developing this method on glass, I used the first Alden Homesite. And if you guys don't know, so through the woods just that way in a school field in the back of it, that was where the Aldens moved to after they lived in downtown Plymouth at the first colony site that's sort of at the bottom of Burrell Hill. And they moved there probably around 1632, maybe a little bit before, but they lived there probably until just around when Senior John Alden died. There is some debate on when they moved out of this building into the new building their new building that is behind us over here. And I think that my thesis based on the glass can really help in understanding the dates of when they moved out. And so the excavation of that house happened in 1960 by our friend Robbins. He's in the bottom picture. And that excavation, and what's he holding up? What is he?
It looks like a foundation stone.
Well, it looks like the writing. I think that's the pixelization of the picture. I think it's just I didn't get a good picture enough, but that is a foundation stone. I don't know if that picture is from this site, but yeah, so that's Robbins. And from that excavation in 1960, he found 1,474 fragments of flat glass. And flat glass just means it was unable to be identified past the point of it being, yep, this is flat. They couldn't see if it was a vessel or something like that more specifically. From those total pieces of glass, I was able to use 764 pieces of flat glass for my thesis. The term flat glass, in that you can only identify it to being flat, can be sort of misleading because just because it's flat doesn't mean it necessarily was in windows, but when people hear the term flat glass, they automatically assume it was a part of a window. It could have been a part of something like a flat-sided glass vessel, something like a case bottle, which I'll explain a little bit later. So my thesis was used to develop a method to identify flat glass past the point of just being flat, and also used to date this glass. No, it really doesn't like it being over here. I'm sorry. That's okay. I can walk over and do it. That's okay. When you think about window glass, it doesn't seem very glamorous. It's not like the archaeology that you guys saw in the house in the new exhibit. It's not really beautiful, it's not really flashy, but it's still really, really important. And windows play a very important role in how people see the world and how the world is experienced from inside of your home and from outside of it as well. It is very well known that the Pilgrims, when they first came here in 1620, that they didn't bring window glass for probably the first decade. And we know that because a lot of people within the first decade, and even through the 1630s, really, really pleaded with colonists to bring windows with them. And they knew that they wanted to have windows because it made them feel like they were in more of a civilized house, and that they weren't just in sort of something that for them probably seemed more like a shack, nothing personalized about it. And in the 17th centuries, windows were not just for aesthetics. They were really essential for how people viewed the outside world. And in the early 17th century, windows were definitely a luxury good. The number and style of windows that you had in your house would really be indicative to a passerby what your status and your wealth was at that time. Also, these glass windows weren't necessarily super pristine as we know them today or colorless, but they did provide some interior light, and it provided a place for people from inside their homes to view what is outside, and it sort of created that mindset of interior and exterior for them. The consumption of window glass in the New World really makes a unique perspective for us to understand how the Pilgrims were interacting back with people in England based on what they were buying, how they were buying it, and really how it came here, because windows don't really travel well. They have to be packed very, very specifically because they shatter so easily. So when you picture a 17th century home, when you picture a 17th century building, this really isn't what you expect. This is from Plymouth Plantation, and we all know that they didn't have glass windows in them. They probably had something like linseed oiled paper in them. And that doesn't really fit to what you think is a home or a house. It's not really satisfying. But the moment you put windows on it, that really makes it satisfying. That's what really makes something look like a home to us. And for us, in our 21st century perspective, we can probably assume that the Pilgrims felt a very similar way because of how hard they tried to get windows to come here, and how often they wrote back to England that people really, really needed to bring windows because this place, quote for them, was uncivilized, and they really wanted to make this place a new England. That all being said, the window glass that the Pilgrims were buying in the 1630s through the 1690s was going through a major production revolution. And for us 21st century observers, we can really better understand how they lived their lives back then by the changes that were going through this glass that we can detect today. During the 17th century, window glass, and more broadly, glass production in general, went through this major revolution because in 1615, wood burning became legalized for all industrial uses, and everyone started to have to use coal. And this coal leaves a chemical marker on the glass. And with this coal production, also came a difference in the type of flux that needed to be used to produce the glass. Flux is just sort of a fancy word for how you lower a melting temperature of sort of a melting pot. Glass is made of silica. Silica has a very, very high melting temperature. You add enough flux, such as kelp, which would be very important. I'm going to say kelp and strontium a lot during this presentation. Kelp helps to lower that melting temperature so it can be more malleable and more easily used. The first time kelp is used for a flux is actually noted in 1660. So I was able to use kelp in its marker in glass, which is strontium. It's a metal element. And when you find its high amount in glass, that makes you able to see when the glass was produced, before or after 1660. So the first half of the 17th century marked this huge influx of, marked this huge influx of continental European immigrants who brought new ideas of how to use lead in glass to make it colorless, and new production styles of how to make the glass better and more usable. With them came the use of kelp and the use of lead. So with all of these new production styles that were coming into England, we can tell those today based on the archaeological samples that we took from the Alden site using an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. So that's a big fancy word for the machine that's next to me, circled in purple. So that machine uses atoms and it shoots it into an artifact, and once the X-rays are in the artifact, it'll bounce around the electrons that are in all of its atoms. And the energy that is emitted by the electrons bouncing around is very indicative of that specific element. And And that element and that specific energy can be read, and the amount of energy that is emitted can also be read and determined. So after that's all read, it produces this, this graph here, and the amount of that element that's in the artifact is actually shown in the height of this peak here, and then each element is sort of along the x-axis this way. Sorry. So the two very important elements that I used for this thesis are lead and strontium. They're the ones that are circled there. These elements are very specific in the way that I can use to date archaeological sites. Strontium for being made before or after 1660, and lead is very important because it's indicative of identifying window glass or case bottle glass, those glass that I was talking about before. I'll tell you what they look like in a minute. And using this method to date archaeological sites is very important because dating within the 17th century, especially in New England, is really, really difficult for a few reasons. And that's because ceramics that were used during the 17th century have a really, really long time depth. People use them for a really long time. And then also, radiocarbon dating, people talk about radiocarbon dating a lot. Usually you use that to date a site. A lot of people in England use it to date a site sort of within a century. If we're trying to figure out when a site was abandoned in the 17th century here, which is so important for us to understand how the Pilgrims lived, you can't really do that because when radiocarbon dates come back, they give you a 100-year age range, which isn't super helpful when you're trying to date within the 17th century. So for my thesis, the XRF gives you that chart, and it gives you that chart for each artifact that you test, and I tested over 700 pieces of glass from just the Alden site. And this is the accumulation of all of those pieces of glass for strontium. That was that element I was telling you about. So the colored dots on there, I'll tell you about in a little bit. But the tests that were conducted created a divide in between the two sort of sections of strontium content. And so the general grouping or the low grouping, which is on your left, that's sort of the general glass. So that's glass that would have been used throughout the whole 17th century. And the glass that's closer to me, that's on your right, that's later glass. That's glass that would have been produced after 1660. And I separated these two groups because there's such a high frequency of glass in the more general group, and that sort of would have skewed my statistical tests to prove that this is something that wasn't sort of just some random data that I was forcing a conclusion on. So after I ran these statistical tests, and if you want to hear about them, you can ask me about it later. It's very complicated and super boring. But so I'm not going to tell you about it. If you want to know, you can ask, that's fine. But so those statistical tests proved that this was not something that was just happening. The strontium was actually different, and it was really statistically significant that the strontium was different on these two sets of groups of glass. And this suggests that the Alden site was occupied probably during the 1660s all the way up until 1700. That's very, very likely that it was probably abandoned probably around 1700, if not a little bit before. If you want to go to the next one. So I wasn't really satisfied with just accepting the fact that, oh yeah, the Alden site was probably abandoned around 1700. I wanted to really push that conclusion, and I did that by using the same tests for the strontium that I did at the Alden site at the Burrell Hill site. The Burrell Hill site is the location of where the Pilgrims first landed and where they first lived in downtown Plymouth. That site was occupied from 1620 by Europeans all the way up until today. There has been schools there, there's been a lot of occupation in that area. So if you see here, if you want to click, the strontium content for the Alden site is much more refined and it's much closer, but the content at Burrell Hill is much wider, and that suggests that the Burrell Hill site was occupied after 1700. 1700 is an important marker because around 1690, kelp is introduced even more into glass, and that strontium content exponentially increases. So these suggest that the Alden site was probably not occupied after 1700, and on this side it suggests that the Burrell Hill site was occupied much into the 18th century, even into the 19th century. And, no, sorry. And that's important because there's been some debate about when the first Alden site was abandoned, because John Alden dies in 1687, and he dies in 1687, and there was a theory about there being a house that was occupied in between John Alden's death and the occupation of this house that's behind us over here. And this suggests that the house might have been occupied during the 1660s and through the 1680s, but not anywhere past that. So that sort of refines that date of occupation a little bit more. Sorry. This also could suggest an idea of dating, but also an idea of choice, that the Aldens might not have been buying the newest and most pretty pieces of glass. It might have been that these are different based on the choices that people were making. Maybe down at Burrell Hill, they had a little bit more money and they were possibly buying the nicer stuff, or that they had the first pickings on the stuff, and that because the Aldens were out here, they might not have been having the first pick at what was coming in off of the ships. So those colored dots that I was talking to you about before, the charts were really dominated by green colored dots, but there were also some other colored dots that were mixed in there. And those dots represent identified pieces of glass. So that means pieces of glass that I came across and I said, oh, this has lead came staining. And lead came staining is, well, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a line right here, and that's staining from the metallic piece that was holding that window glass in with the window. And then other pieces that were identified as flat glass came out and had these curves on them, and you're not going to have a curved piece of glass in your window. It just wouldn't fit, it would fall out. Those are case bottle glasses. So on your left, nope, on your right, those are case bottles. So case bottles were used to ship anything from wine to oil to beer, and when you fragment them at archaeological sites, they are so delicate that the middle pieces really look like flat glass. They really look like window glass, and it can be really hard to differentiate between the two of them. And therefore it's kind of hard to identify where the outside of a site is, if you're looking for where the windows are, so you're looking for where the structure is, or you're looking for a storage place. So storage place, more likely to have a case bottle with your storage vessels. And the outside of a house, you're more likely to have windows with your window glass. So it became sort of important to be able to identify between the two of these, because case bottles aren't going to have that same change in the kelp addition until much later. So that would sort of skew your data if you're not identifying the piece of glass correctly. So the red dots, oh, the colors changed. That's good. So the green dots are unidentified pieces of glass, and you can see that that really dominates the chart on this side. But on this side, those are the unidentified pieces, are the red ones. So it is really difficult to be able to make a generalization about a group of data if you don't know what it is. So while I was testing these, if you want to go to the next one. While I was testing these, The lead. Yes. So while I was testing these, I noticed a really big spike in only some of the glass samples. So only some of them had a really high lead content and others had a really, really small lead content. And that's sort of, I couldn't figure it out, and I initially assumed that it was from chemical leaching, which is just as water comes through the soil, certain elements like iron and lead, or I thought lead, leach, and then when they come in contact with an object, they'll adhere to that object. And after I did a little bit of research about the XRF, the machine that I was using, and chemical leaching, I discovered that the amount of lead and the difference between the lead contents of the pieces of glass was super significant, and it wasn't necessarily from chemical leaching. So I thought of the idea of, oh, what if this is actually a case bottle issue? So I went into the Alden Collection, and there were 50 pieces of case bottle glass that were very indicative of being case bottles. And I tested all of them. All of them had a higher lead content. And I went back and looked at all of the window glass from the Alden Collection that was very obviously window glass, and the lead content did not match at all. They were very, very separated. So in the previous charts, you could see that the identified pieces were sort of scattered all over the chart. In these ones, the case bottles are all on this side, and all of the window glass is on this side. So that really suggests to you that there's something going on with the lead content in these artifacts. So I ran the same statistical tests that I did with the strontium with these ones, and it showed that this was very statistically significant. And from that, I was able to build an identification for flat glass, not only a dating method, but also an identification. So this is super confusing, and it's going to go away in a second, but this is everything that I was able to accumulate from the Alden glass that I tested. If you want to go to the next one. So from everything that I just told you, which was a lot of information, I was able to separate the strontium counts at 30,000. So that made a group of high or later glass based on the strontium amount, which you can see in these lines, and then a lower, which is more general, probably used throughout the 17th century. And then from that, after I figured out the lead content, I was able to make a further identification on these pieces of glass. So everything here was initially just identified as flat glass, and that was it. That's all they knew about it. But I was able to date them all and separate things much further into further categories so we could better understand these sites. So this is the data from the Alden Collection. This is sort of the accumulation and the really, really important stuff. So from this, you can see that the Alden site has much fewer later, quote, later pieces of glass than Burrell Hill. So Burrell Hill, even though being occupied at the beginning, was occupied at a much longer time depth, so this chart just reinforces my conclusion that I told you before. But an additional piece of information is, even though there's much more early glass at the Alden site, the identification of bottles and windows, relatively, they're only 100 apart, but they're a much higher number. And the glass at Burrell Hill, even though a smaller number, that's half. So there are 68 windows and only 35 case bottles from the earlier group. So that suggests that there being half, that it's possible that at Burrell Hill, that excavation might not have a storage place. That might be a living surface, where at the Alden site, that big excavation was not only a living space, but also had a storage space. So from this, we could further make interpretations and compare sites across 10 miles, I think it is. So it's the same group of people, but living in totally different locations and developing their houses and developing their lives in a much, much different way. Thank you. So all of those conclusions are sort of complicated, but it's really, really important for us to be able to understand when sites might have been abandoned and how sites might have been used. And archaeology can be really complicated, but using these artifacts, we can really, really look into how your ancestors lived and how they built their homes and how they connected back with England that they had left. So thank you. Oh, do you have any questions?
Comments?
Yeah.
Oh, in the back. Yeah.
At what point was glass made here versus imported?
That's a really good question. So down in Jamestown in Virginia, one of the first production ventures that they took was a glass house. That's just a word for a glass production site. And it failed in 2 years. The next attempt was in Salem in Massachusetts in the 1640s. That also failed pretty quickly. And then the only chartered glass house in the 13 colonies before the Revolution was in New Jersey, and it made maybe 1,000 vessels a year. So, and they were really crude, and there's sort of an obnoxious text of a guy who writes back to England saying that they don't have to worry about the glass production in the New World because everything's kind of cruddy. So it's really not common, and it's not enough to produce to support windows or vessels or anything that's here. Everything has to be shipped in from England.
Could you tell from where the glass came by maybe the pontil glass?
So a pontil mark is it's a stick that you use to help blow the glass, and when you crack it off, it'll make a specific mark from the crack. I only had, sorry, let me think, from the 700, I think I had 2 bases, so it's not a big enough sample for me to be able to tell.
Like whether it was made in one area of England or,
no.
or another?
There's some debate whether you can or not. There's more of a debate on, people are more accepting about pontil marks for time depth rather than location, but that's not super my expertise because I only had 2 that had actual pontil marks, so I didn't look into it a whole
Does it mean
lot.
the glass concentrated so much deeper?
Yes, exactly.
Where it broke off from the,
Mhm.
from the blow point?
Yeah.
That word you use, kelp, is that seaweed?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, kelp
I
is
didn't know what
seaweed.
it was.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Well, I thought it was seaweed, but how come it got into the glass?
So,
And that's in England that the kelp was?
yes.
But it was seaweed, okay.
Yeah, so sorry, I meant to say that. So kelp is seaweed, it's the same thing. So in the 15th and the 14th centuries, the flux, the thing they used to lower that melting temperature, a lot of times they're using oak, like the bark of the oak, and they'll burn it down, and they'll add it to the sand that they're melting down to make the glass, to lower the temperature. But after they start using coal to fire their furnaces, the oak isn't enough, and also they can't use oak because they're not allowed to burn wood. So they try using ferns, but there's not enough. And people in, I think 1630, I don't know the exact date, but they use kelp ash for dyeing. I think it makes like sort of a pale red.
So does it color the glass? Is that why there's lines in the glass?
So the glass that we get is green, and that's from the iron content. A lot of that is from the silica from the sand. You can purify it, which is what how I determined the sort of end date of 1700 for that site is around 1690. The English developed clear glass, and that's based on the lead and the purification that they do for the silica. I don't think they use enough kelp ash to actually color the glass. A lot of people use, or back then they used manganese to decolorize it or to colorize it even more, depending on the content that they were
But
using.
you're using it like the chemical, that you're using the chemical analysis, and you're finding this residue of the seaweed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
When did they first start to make glass here successfully?
I would say the one in New Jersey is successful because at least they were supplying their community. But they're after,
Like drinking glasses and stuff like
yeah.
that.
After the revolution, so that glass house closes during the revolution, but they open up pretty quickly afterwards. So I would say that that one's the most successful. It starts,
1780. 17.
it starts before that. It gets a charter in, I think, the 1720s, but it's sort of not really hugely productive until 1780, because then they can actually get the charter to produce a lot more, and then they don't get the fines because glass isn't coming in here from England anymore.
No, I have two glasses sitting in my cabinet that's folded from the Alden house, and my mother wrote notes about it. She said, first cut glass in America, so I think I was trying to
cool.
say when it would be. It'd have to be late 1700s, almost 18.
What kind of glass is it?
Well, there's three of them, two match and the others ultimate. They're tumblers, and just roughly cut. They're not terribly decorative. A couple with a little bit striated.
Oh, cool. That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're really nice.
I don't know. I was just trying to think. Okay, they came to this house. Who did they belong to? The first 5 generations are here through the
Yeah.
revolution. So
Yeah,
I'm trying to think. Would they be Judah's? Would they be his dad Briggs? Where it fit in?
I would have
I
to
think
look at
I
them
would
to be able
think,
to
yeah.
see that a
I'll
little
bring
bit
them
more.
sometime.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated. The thousands of shards you looked at, how big were the biggest ones? And I'm fascinated that it seems like when you're talking about flat glass, and I would have thought the things that would have survived have been the thicker parts of the bottles, as an example, not the flat parts. And so I'm just curious, is there a range of sizes that survives in these hundreds
There's
of
a
years?
huge range of sizes. So window pane glasses, you get typically during the 17th century, they're about 4.5 inches on the longest side. So that's 4.5, 4.5, and then across they're usually about 5 to 6. So that's a pretty sizable piece. So they do vary in thickness, but not as much as you would think. There's different types of window glass production that create different thicknesses. So the thicker parts do survive, but the thinner parts, when they are fragmented, that just gives me more pieces to test. So for the case bottles, they're the thinnest at the center, which is the most flat. So that adds to that complication of being able to identify. So the thicker parts are what she was talking about, the pontil, that's at the bottom. Those are really, really thick. And then the sort of corners at the faces are also very thick. So after I discovered this, I went back to the collection and gathered everything that was, this is obviously a case bottle, and they were all very, very thick.
If you found glass that would be like after 1700 in the first site, this house was built in the 1660s, is there any possibility that both buildings were up at the, or was still inhabitable at the same time?
I would have to test glass that was original to this house to be able to determine that, but it's, I wouldn't see why they wouldn't be able to stand at the same time, absolutely. Because how many kids did they have? 9? 10. So all of those people in a house that's maybe this length, but only to this second bay, that's a lot of people to be in one house. And yes, during that time, they don't have the idea of privacy as much as we do today. But I couldn't see why not they were both standing at the same time.
All right, another question. How many panes of glass are original?
To this house?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know that.
And if so, how are they being protected?
I mean, because they changed the windows on this house. They would have had earlier windows and then they
Okay, so-
changed them in the 18th
So that
century.
basically there are no original windows.
No, none from that earliest part of the house. We don't know.
Yeah, the other question I had was, when you were saying about them starting to make glass here,
Have you studied wills and inventories and things for equipment or people's occupations?
Yes, yes. So John Alden was a cooper when he left England, and I feel like from the wills that I've studied, when people come here, they have to become a jack of all trades because there's nothing, there's no industry. So he doesn't necessarily become a glazier, but he does become really important to the militia in the army in downtown Plymouth. So he does have a lot of military not armaments, but artillery pieces and that sort of stuff that was found in the first house. Yeah. Did you?
Is the strontium, is that just like a byproduct of melting down the sand to make the glass?
So
Like when you melt down the silica?
That's an interesting question. So when you burn up the kelp, I don't know exactly how, but in present day kelp today, you get the same strontium content that you would in the 17th century. And they are able to tell that by the isotope analysis. So sort of complicated, you have to disintegrate pieces of glass from today and then kelp, or pieces of glass from then and then kelp from today. And there's a sort of lengthy chemical process of how you get their isotopes, but the isotope ratios of glass from after 1660 matches present day kelp isotope ratios. So I think that the strontium comes from the seawater content. I don't know exactly how strontium is attached.
So it's in the seawater?
I think it's in the seawater and it makes up the kelp.
Okay.
I think. That's some molecular chemistry that's sort of past me.
Based on your analysis of the artifacts, is it possible that John Alden died around 1680, whatever, and then there was no more contribution of glass, or maybe the next generation might have lived in that house past his death? I mean, I think you touched on that, but I wasn't quite sure what your conclusion was.
Yeah. So it's sort of complicated because we know that strontium content increases exponentially after 1700. But in between 1660 and 1700, that date is sort of complicated, and because there's only a decade in between his death and the point at which glass would have come here and the kelp would have been increasing, I would like to suggest that the house probably wasn't improved past his death, but saying that someone actually lived there, I think it was probably lived in up until his death, definitely. But that doesn't mean it wasn't lived in that decade, especially if this house wasn't necessarily fit to hold everyone quite yet. It might have been an outhouse, it might have been something that was utilized sort of auxiliary to this house, at least after that decade.
It's the barn and the storage place,
Exactly,
you know,
exactly. That's probably pretty
it's the
likely.
outbuilding at that point.
Yeah.